White supremacy, with a tanSome political myths refuse to die despite all evidence the contrary. Here's another: when white people are no longer a majority, racism will fade and the US will never be a white country again. This myth was reinforced recently when the US Census 2020 report revealed that people who identified as white alone declined for the first time since the census began in 1790. The majority of Americans under 18 are now people of color, and people whose identity as multiracial increased by 276% over the last decade.
These census figures seemed to validate a common assumption: the U.S. is barreling toward becoming a rainbow nation around 2045, when white people are projected to become a minority. The year has been depicted as the countdown to the white apocalypse and dreadful news for white supremacists. Two commentators even predicted the U.S. white majority will soon disappear forever. It's now taken as a given that the browning of America will lead to the erosion of white supremacy.
I used to believe those predictions. Now I have a different conclusion. Don't ever underestimate white supremacy's ability to adapt. The assumption that more racial diversity equals more racial equality is a dangerous myth. Racial diversity can function as a cloaking device, concealing the most powerful forms of white supremacy while giving the appearance of racial progress. Racism will likely be just as entrenched in a browner America as it is now. It will still be white supremacy, with a tan.
My personal stake in a multiracial America. I don't like raising such a pessimistic scenario, in part for personal reasons. I want to believe my country is on the verge of this brown new world where there will be such a rich gumbo of skin hues, hair textures and racially ambiguous people that racism will lose its sting. My family is a symbol of these demographic changes. My mother's Irish, my father was black. My wife is an immigrant from Central America with a biracial mother and a white Ladino father who was Jewish and Castilian. My stepmother is Chilean, and half of my siblings are Afro-Latino. I have one relative with blonde hair and blue eyes who moves through the world as a young white man, but he's really Afro-Latino. And I have another black relative who went to court to argue that he was white. The 2020 census could have used my family portrait for a poster. This yearning is not driven by some wish that people of color will someday rule over whites. It's a hope for a more just America, the hope that we can somehow escape the tribalism that tore other countries apart. That hope was captured by one of the savviest commentators on race in America, in a passage I can't seem to forget. After President Obama was re-elected in 2012, David Simon, creator of the HBO series The Wire, wrote, "We know what happened next. Donald Trump was elected president. White supremacists marched in Charlottesville. Rioters waved Confederate flags during January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol." The list goes on. It turns out that the reports of white supremacy's demise were exaggerated. Whiteness is elastic. White supremacy isn't just more resilient than many assume. It's also elastic. Consider how whiteness has been defined. It's a prime example of how white supremacy adapts. The US has broadened its definition of white people throughout history enough to maintain power over black, Asian and Latino people, writes political scientist Justin Jest in a recent essay, What the Majority-Minority Shift Really Means for America. Through a historical lens, being white in America today is like belonging to a once exclusive social club that had to loosen its membership criteria to stay afloat. Jest writes, "Why do so many racial groups gravitate toward whiteness? The answer is both pragmatic and psychological. It's due to a racial hierarchy that places whiter-looking people at the top and darker-skinned people at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Sometimes looking white puts money directly into your pocket," says Tanya K. Hernandez, author of the forthcoming book Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. You get access to jobs, opportunities and being viewed as competent. But there's also a psychological benefit, that feeling of having enhanced status, of being part of whiteness. For those who fret about the disappearing white majority, I say look at history. The numbers and types of people who are defined as white may change, but the status and power that comes with being white has remained the same. The future of whiteness could rest with Latinos. It's a hard truth for me to accept, because I see that racial hierarchy at work within my family. I have young male relatives who appear to the world as black, and one who appears as white. They might as well live in different universes. One is an artistic teenager with curly blonde hair, blue eyes and pale skin who is already more physically imposing than most men. I call him an undercover brother. When a classmate tried unsuccessfully to get him suspended by accusing him of bullying her, I surprised myself by telling my wife, "Thank God he looks white." If the same accusation had been made against a darker relative of mine, the outcome may have been different. Someday he may even mark white on his census forms. Other Latino Americans have already made that same choice. This is another way that whiteness preserves its dominance. In the 2010 census, for example, researchers discovered that some 1.2 million Americans who had identified as Hispanic, Latino or Spanish origin a decade earlier had changed their race from some other race to white. The data also call into question whether America is destined to become a so-called minority-majority nation, where whites represent a minority of the nation's population, said the New York Times. Those projections assume that Hispanics aren't white, but if Hispanics ultimately identify as white Americans, then whites will remain the majority for the foreseeable future. That number, however, plunged in the 2020 census. It revealed a drastic drop in the number of Latinos or Hispanics who identify as white. That drop may be due to Black Lives Matter protests and former President Trump's well-documented hostility to non-white immigrants and his administration's unsuccessful attempt to reduce the count of Latinos by manipulating the 2020 census. The future of whiteness in America may rest with Latino people. It could go either way. A study suggests that Latino identity fades across successive generations as immigrant connections fade away. If large numbers of Latino people identify as white in the future, whiteness will expand. The enhanced status and socioeconomic benefits that come from identifying as white will be too tempting for many to ignore. Racism in unexpected places.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe